Imagine walking into a grand royal palace, its walls lined with portraits of kings and queens, each one looking back at you with the weight of centuries in their eyes. Now, picture opening a hidden door, one that does not lead to the well-known halls of the Windsors, but to a vault of forgotten stories. Tales of exile, survival, and bloodlines that stretch far beyond Britain. Behind the polished image of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, lies a past far more dramatic than most people realize. Born a prince of Greece and Denmark, raised amid upheaval, and tied by blood to German nobility and the tragic Romanovs of Russia, Philip's story is not one of a single crown, but of an entire continent. His journey began in the chaos of political turmoil, when as an infant he had to be carried out of Greece in an orange crate aboard a British warship. From there, his life unfolded across borders, France, Germany, and Britain, each chapter leaving its mark on his character. His Danish grandfather, known as the grandfather of Europe, built dynastic links that stretched into nearly every royal house. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, overcame personal struggles and became a figure of extraordinary resilience. His Russian cousins met their fate in the Revolution, a reminder of how fragile monarchy could be. These were the legacies that shaped Philip long before he ever stood at the side of Queen Elizabeth II. What we uncover when we open these royal vaults is not just the story of a consort, but of a man whose ancestry reveals the hidden currents of European history. His life was both a privilege and a peril, a tapestry of nations and dynasties that prepared him for a role like no other. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we take you deep into the untold origins of Prince Philip, exploring the extraordinary heritage that shaped the man behind the crown. Underneath the grand history of European monarchies lies a network of family ties, forgotten stories, and surprising beginnings. When most people hear the name of Prince Philip, the late Duke of Edinburgh and husband of Queen Elizabeth II, they often connect him only with the House of Windsor. For decades, he was at the side of the British monarch, becoming part of the most visible royal family in the world. Yet his own roots stretch far beyond the borders of Britain, into histories that many either do not know or have chosen to ignore. His life was shaped not only by the traditions of the Windsors, but also by his Greek and Danish heritage, which carried its own share of drama, displacement, and resilience. To understand Philip fully is to step into these overlooked vaults of royal history, and in doing so we find a story that is both remarkable and deeply human. Prince Philip was born in the year 1921 on the island of Corfu in Greece. At birth, he was not British at all. He was a prince of Greece and Denmark because his father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, belonged to a branch of the Greek royal family that itself came from Danish origins. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, added German ties into the mix. This meant that from the very beginning, Philip was a child of a complex Europe, carrying in his blood the legacies of several kingdoms. Yet when his name comes up today, most accounts begin with his marriage to the young Princess Elizabeth, as though everything before that were only a prelude. What often goes missing are the struggles and influences that defined his childhood, shaped his character, and gave him the determination that later marked his service and public life. The story of his Greek and Danish roots is not one of power and grandeur, but of instability and exile. His family had already lived through great upheaval before Philip was even old enough to understand the world around him. The Greek monarchy, which had been installed in the 19th century, was often contested. Political turmoil in Greece led to coups, wars, and periods of monarchy followed by republic. Philip's father, Prince Andrew, was caught in one of these storms when Greece lost to Turkey in the War of 1919 to 1922. The monarchy faced blame, and Prince Andrew was accused of treason. He and his family had to flee the country. Philip, still an infant, was carried to safety aboard a British warship in a fruit crate that served as his crib. It was not a start one would expect for someone who later stood at the center of one of the world's most stable monarchies. His Danish connection comes from an earlier chapter of Greek history. When Greece sought a new monarch in the 19th century, the powers of Europe looked to Denmark. Prince William of Denmark, from the House of Glucksburg, was chosen to become King George I of Greece in the year 1863. This made the Danish royal family the ruling dynasty of Greece. Philip's grandfather, King George I of Greece, was that same Danish prince. Thus, Philip was both Greek and Danish by birth, though his early life in Greece was brief and overshadowed by turmoil. What makes this background so fascinating is how it shaped Philip's sense of identity. Unlike Queen Elizabeth, whose roots were deeply fixed in Britain, Philip grew up as an exile, moving from one country to another. His childhood was marked by a lack of permanence. After leaving Greece, his family scattered. His father lived much of his life away from his children. His mother, who suffered from mental illness, spent long periods in institutions. Philip himself was passed between relatives in France, Germany, and Britain. At school in Germany, he experienced the political rise of the Nazis, but he soon left for Gordonstoun in Scotland, a school known for its focus on discipline and character building. These years left him with a tough, resilient nature, a sense of independence, and a directness that became his hallmark. But all of it was rooted in the instability of his early heritage. Why then are his Greek and Danish roots so often overlooked? Part of the reason lies in the image that had to be built when Philip married into the British royal family. By the time he became engaged to Princess Elizabeth in the 1940s, the world was recovering from the Second World War. Anti-German feeling was still strong in Britain. Philip had to renounce his foreign titles, become a naturalized British subject, and take the surname Mountbatten, a more English-sounding version of Battenberg. His Greek and Danish identities did not fit the narrative of a modern British monarchy seeking stability and unity after the war. The focus shifted to presenting him as a loyal British naval officer, a man who would stand firmly at Elizabeth's side. There was also a matter of convenience in the way history is told. The Windsor family represented continuity, and Philip's background did not align neatly with that story. His roots were complicated, with connections to monarchies that had fallen, been overthrown, or existed only with the support of foreign powers. It was easier for the institution to highlight his service to Britain and his life as Duke of Edinburgh, rather than dwell on the messiness of Greek politics or Danish royal links. This selective memory served the monarchy, but it left behind a fascinating part of Philip's story that explains much of his character. When we look more closely at those forgotten narratives, we see how they shaped not only Philip, but also his role in the modern monarchy. His Greek background gave him a first-hand understanding of instability, which perhaps explains why he valued duty, discipline, and continuity so deeply. He knew what it meant to lose a throne, to live as a refugee, to adapt to foreign cultures. That experience of dislocation likely made him more determined to give stability to his wife and family. At the same time, his Danish connection linked him to a tradition of monarchies that adjusted and survived by compromise and adaptation. The Danish royal family is one of the oldest in Europe, and its legacy gave Philip a sense of belonging to something enduring, even if his own direct experience of it was distant. Beyond the political context, there is also the personal side. Philip's upbringing was not easy. He was the youngest child and the only son. His sisters all married German princes, which complicated his ties during the years of Nazi Germany. His mother, Princess Alice, had a difficult life, struggling with illness and spending years away from him. His father lived in Monaco, largely detached from his son's upbringing. For a boy to grow up in such circumstances meant that resilience had to be developed early. Philip learned to stand alone, to adapt quickly, and to keep emotions guarded. These qualities later came across in his blunt manner and his reputation for being straightforward, sometimes to the point of causing offense. Yet beneath it was the survival instinct of someone whose childhood taught him never to expect stability. It is important to recognize that his Danish and Greek roots did not disappear from his life entirely. He kept contact with relatives across Europe, and his mother, Princess Alice, eventually lived her final years in Buckingham Palace. She had become a nun and devoted her life to helping others, even sheltering Jewish families during the Second World War. Her example of resilience and faith clearly influenced Philip, even if their relationship had long been fragmented. The Danish ties also endured through family connections, as the royal families of Europe remain intertwined. But in the public eye, these links remained in the background, overshadowed by his British identity. By opening these vaults of his story, we see that Prince Philip was not just the consort who walked a step behind the Queen. He was also a man shaped by displacement, by an unusual royal inheritance, and by cultures that were often in conflict with one another. His Greek birth gave him the experience of fragility, his Danish blood tied him to a broader European royal tradition, and his British service gave him purpose. Together, these influences created a figure who could support the monarchy not just as a ceremonial spouse, but as someone who understood the fragility and the strength of royal institutions. Philip's unexpected origins remind us that royal history is rarely as neat as it is presented. The Windsor connection dominates because it is current, but behind it lies a web of forgotten narratives that explain why he became the man he was. To leave them aside is to miss the story of a boy carried out of Greece in a crate, a young man whose family was scattered, and an adult who forged an identity through service and duty. When we revisit those forgotten beginnings, we understand him not just as the Duke of Edinburgh, but as the product of many histories woven together. Prince Philip's life cannot be understood without tracing the deep and complicated paths that linked him to Denmark, a kingdom that itself has often stood quietly but firmly at the center of Europe's royal web. His Greek birth is often remembered as a passing fact, but the Danish thread is what gave his family its throne in Greece and linked him to a dynasty that seemed to hold half the courts of Europe in its palm. To open this part of the story is to step into the world of Prince Christian IX of Denmark, who came to be known as the grandfather of Europe. Through careful and well-placed marriages of his children, he managed to connect his relatively modest Danish house to the great powers of the continent. His descendants sat on thrones from Russia to Greece, from Britain to Norway, and from Germany to Spain. Philip was one of the many who could trace his lineage back to this figure, which meant that his life was never simply about Britain and Greece. It was about a wider network that constantly shaped the fate of monarchies across Europe. Prince Christian IX reigned in Denmark in the 19th century and lived long enough to see his family spread across the continent. He had 6 children, and nearly all of them married into ruling dynasties. One daughter, Alexandra, became Queen of the United Kingdom by marrying King Edward VII. Another daughter, Dagmar, married into the Russian imperial family and became Empress Maria Fyodorovna, mother of Tsar Nicholas II. A son, George, became King George I of Greece, placed on the throne when the great powers decided that Greece needed a monarch after the deposition of its first king, Otto of Bavaria. Through these unions, the Danish dynasty extended its reach far beyond its own borders. This mattered for Philip because it meant that his grandfather was not only king of Greece, but also a member of this far-reaching family network. Philip's Danish heritage, therefore, was not an incidental detail, but a defining part of his family's fate. When Greece sought stability in the mid-19th century, it turned to this Danish prince who could bring legitimacy, connections, and support from the other great powers. King George I of Greece, Philip's grandfather, reigned for 50 years and established the dynasty in which Philip was born. Without Denmark's influence and the deliberate strategy of Christian IX, Philip would not have been born into royalty at all. The Greek throne was not native to Philip's family, but imported through Denmark. This foreignness was both a strength and a weakness. It gave the monarchy external support, but it also meant it was seen by some as lacking true Greek roots, a factor that contributed to the instability that forced Philip's family into exile. This background also sheds light on why Philip was such a European figure at heart. He did not belong to one country or one tradition. His family was a product of dynastic politics that spanned the continent. His cousins and relatives were spread across Britain, Russia, Germany, and beyond. As a child, he could claim kinship with nearly every royal house in Europe. Yet this wide network did not protect him from hardship. If anything, it meant that political shifts and conflicts in Europe hit closer to home. When the Russian monarchy fell in the Revolution of 1917, Philip's family lost close relatives, including the murdered Romanovs, who were his second cousins. The collapse of the Greek monarchy during his infancy meant his own immediate family was displaced. The very ties that once looked like strength became burdens in a century that turned against monarchy and privilege. Alongside this Danish inheritance came another extraordinary influence: his mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg. Her story is one of courage, struggle, and remarkable faith. Born in Windsor Castle in 1885, she was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Though she was born into privilege, she faced significant challenges from childhood. She was deaf from birth, a fact that might have limited her role in a society that expected royal women to play public parts. Instead, she developed exceptional lip-reading skills and learned several languages, making her both determined and resourceful. These qualities would mark her entire life. Princess Alice married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, Philip's father, in 1903. She lived through the turmoil of Greek politics and the family's eventual exile. But her challenges were not only political. She suffered from severe mental health difficulties in the 1920s and 1930s and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. For years, she was confined to sanatoriums in Switzerland and Germany, often separated from her children. Philip, still a boy, grew up with little contact with her during this time, adding to the sense of instability that defined his early years. Yet despite these struggles, Alice later rebuilt her life with extraordinary strength. She became deeply religious, founded a nursing order of Greek Orthodox nuns, and devoted herself to helping the poor in Athens. During the Second World War, she sheltered Jewish families in her home, an act of great bravery at a time when Greece was under Nazi occupation. This legacy of resilience and compassion left its mark on Philip, even if their relationship was complicated by distance during his childhood. The fact that his mother overcame both personal suffering and political turmoil to dedicate herself to service echoed in Philip's own lifelong commitment to duty. Where Alice found purpose in faith and charity, Philip found it in the Navy and later in supporting the monarchy. Both were, in their own ways, shaped by loss and by the need to stand firm in the face of upheaval. The Danish influence and the example of Princess Alice came together in shaping Philip's character. From Denmark came the awareness of a dynasty that had survived not by isolation, but by constant adaptation and connection. From his mother came the lesson that adversity could be endured and transformed into service. These forces did not make his early life easy, but they gave him the tools he needed to build his own path. He was not simply a British naval officer who married the heir to the throne. He was a man who had learned from exile, from scattered family, and from a heritage that spanned several monarchies. In his school years, these influences showed in his resilience. He was sent first to schools in France and Germany before finally settling at Gordonstoun in Scotland, where the emphasis was on discipline, physical endurance, and service to others. The school's philosophy resonated with the toughness he had already learned through his childhood. While other boys might have found the harsh conditions difficult, Philip thrived. He had already known displacement and loneliness. The rigors of Gordonstoun were simply another challenge to be faced with determination. This foundation carried into his naval career. Philip joined the British Royal Navy in 1939 and served with distinction during the Second World War. His ability to adapt, his discipline, and his courage all bore the imprint of his upbringing. He had seen how monarchies could collapse if they did not adapt, and he had seen how personal suffering could be turned into service. These lessons gave him the strength to carve out his role in Britain, first as a naval officer and later as consort to the Queen. The hidden influence of Denmark is often missing from public accounts of his life, yet it explains much about the way Philip understood his role. He knew that royalty was not simply about ceremony. It was about survival, adaptation, and connection. His Danish ancestors had secured their place in Europe by weaving bonds across nations. His mother had shown him that even in exile and hardship, one could live with purpose. Together, these lessons gave him a practical and unsentimental view of monarchy. He was not romantic about it. He was realistic, sometimes even blunt. That bluntness was often criticized, but it was the honesty of someone who knew how fragile crowns could be. As we step back and look at this legacy, it becomes clear that Philip's story is more than just the tale of a prince who married a queen. It is the story of how the Danish dynasty's strategy, the endurance of his mother, and the turmoil of his childhood combined to shape a man who could support one of the most visible monarchies in the world. To overlook these influences is to miss the deeper meaning of his life. He was not only a consort but also a survivor, a bridge between royal traditions, and a living link to a Europe that was far more connected than most realize. The story of Prince Philip becomes even more vivid when we move from his Danish legacy and the influence of his remarkable mother to the Greek side of his family, where turbulence and exile cast a long shadow over his childhood. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, was at the center of one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the Greek monarchy, and it was this upheaval that forced Philip into the unsettled life that defined his early years. If Denmark gave him royal legitimacy, Greece gave him hardship and displacement, lessons that would stay with him long after he had left the Aegean shores. Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark was the fourth son of King George I of Greece, who, as already noted, was originally a Danish prince invited to take the Greek throne in the year 1863. This meant that Andrew was born into a family that ruled Greece not through ancient Greek lineage, but through the arrangement of European powers. The monarchy in Greece, though longed for by some as a stabilizing force, was never entirely secure. It was caught in the crosswinds of national politics, foreign influence, and regional instability. Andrew himself had a military career in the Greek army and became a figure in the events that would soon transform both his life and the life of his youngest son, Philip. The defining moment came during the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, often remembered as part of the larger struggle following the First World War. Greece, encouraged by the Allies, sought to expand its territory into Asia Minor, where many ethnic Greeks lived. But the campaign went disastrously wrong. The Greek army, initially successful, was eventually overwhelmed by the Turkish forces under Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. What followed was a crushing defeat for Greece, a humanitarian disaster for the Greeks of Asia Minor, and deep political turmoil at home. Prince Andrew, serving as a commander, was caught up in the chaos. After the war ended in catastrophe, the monarchy and its associates were blamed for the defeat. A military tribunal was convened, and several officials were executed in what became known as the Trial of the Six. Prince Andrew himself was arrested and charged with dereliction of duty. The situation could have ended in his execution, but international pressure, especially from Britain, intervened. In December of 1922, the family was forced into exile. The young Philip, then a baby of only 18 months, was carried aboard a British warship, HMS Calypso, in an improvised crib made from an orange crate. It was a symbolic beginning. Born a prince, but leaving his homeland in circumstances more like those of a refugee. This exile defined the rest of Philip's childhood. The family first went to Paris, living in reduced circumstances. His father, embittered by the disgrace and stripped of his role in Greece, distanced himself from his family and eventually moved to Monte Carlo, living a life of detachment and estrangement. Philip's mother, Princess Alice, was already struggling with her mental health and became increasingly unwell in the years that followed, leading to her confinement in sanatoriums. The result was that Philip grew up essentially without parents. His sisters, much older than him, married German princes and moved away. By the time he was still a boy, Philip was shuttled between relatives, relying on uncles and cousins for guardianship. This fractured family life was a direct outcome of the turbulence of the Greek monarchy in the early 20th century. Where other royal children grew up with stability, Philip's earliest lessons were about uncertainty and survival. He once remarked in adulthood, when asked about his childhood, that he simply had to get on with it. That bluntness masked a much deeper reality, the resilience that came from having nothing fixed to hold on to. In Paris, he lived in a modest home with his mother before her illness took her away. At school, he was often separated from her and had to depend on the goodwill of relatives abroad. The political landscape of Greece at the time explains why his family's fate was so precarious. The monarchy had been installed by foreign powers, and while it was accepted at times, it was never secure from opposition. Greece experienced repeated changes in government, coups, and brief republics. The monarchy would be restored, then overthrown again. For Philip's father, this meant a life of uncertainty even before the disaster of the Asia Minor campaign. For Philip himself, it meant that his identity as a Greek prince was fragile from the start. He had the title, but no kingdom to call home, and no stable court in which to grow up. The exile also brought with it personal struggles that shaped Philip's character. He inherited from his father a sense of distance, perhaps even detachment, for Prince Andrew never reconciled with his son in a meaningful way. The absence of his father meant Philip learned to stand on his own from an early age. From his mother, though absent during much of his childhood, he inherited resilience of a different kind, the capacity to endure suffering and transform it into purpose. These parental legacies were not given in the traditional way, through active upbringing, but rather through their absence and example. The voids they left forced Philip to build his own inner strength. It is striking that Philip, who later became a symbol of duty and stability, began life in such unsettled conditions. The Greek monarchy of the early 20th century showed him firsthand how fragile crowns could be, how quickly power and privilege could be lost, and how political storms could sweep away entire dynasties. This awareness, etched into his childhood, never left him. It perhaps explains why, as consort to the Queen of the United Kingdom, he valued order, continuity, and discipline. Where his father's generation had been swept aside by chaos, Philip dedicated himself to making sure the monarchy he served would not meet the same fate. The Greek side of his story also gave him a sense of identity that was never fully claimed by Britain, even after he gave up his Greek and Danish titles. In many ways, he was always an outsider, even within the royal family he married into. His accent, his directness, and his occasionally brusque manner reflected a man who had never been softened by a sheltered upbringing. He carried within him the mark of exile, of someone who had known loss and did not take stability for granted. The narrative of his Greek roots, however, was often left in the shadows, much like his Danish ties. It did not fit neatly into the story that the British monarchy wanted to tell about itself in the mid-20th century. Yet to ignore it is to miss the foundation of his character. From Greece he inherited not only titles that had no throne, but also the deeper lessons of resilience. The political turbulence of early 20th century Greece was not just a backdrop. It was the very reason he grew up the way he did, without parents, without a stable home, and with a determination forged. As an adult, Philip rarely spoke at length about his father, and for good reason. Prince Andrew lived far from his son, leading a life of bitterness and isolation, and he died in 1944 while Philip was serving in the Navy. But even in absence, Andrew's story was central to Philip's. The exile of 1922 shaped the trajectory of his life, pushing him toward Britain, toward the Navy, and eventually toward the role that would define him. The irony is that the failure of the Greek monarchy, which drove his family from their home, was also the event that set him on the path to becoming consort to the British Queen. In looking at Philip's Greek heritage, then, we see more than just titles. We see the story of a family caught in political storms, of a boy shaped by absence and exile, and of a man who built resilience from those beginnings. The Greek monarchy's instability gave him his earliest lessons, and his father's downfall gave him the drive to make something more stable of his own life. These struggles were not decorative details in his biography, but the foundation of his strength. The Greek upheavals that marked Prince Philip's childhood were only part of the larger puzzle of his identity. His bloodline stretched far beyond the shores of Corfu, Parisian exile, and even the Danish dynasty that had once secured a throne for his grandfather. To understand him fully, we must also open the door to the German and Russian dimensions of his ancestry, which reveal another set of stories, some celebrated, some deliberately muted. These connections to German nobility and the Russian Romanovs were integral to his heritage, yet in the political climate of the 20th century, they were often spoken of in careful whispers, downplayed for obvious reasons. Still, the traces remain, not only in family trees but also in the way they shaped the world Philip inherited and the man he became. Through his mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, Philip belonged to a branch of German nobility that had both privilege and peril tied to it. The Battenbergs were themselves descended from the Grand Dukes of Hesse, a state in the old German Empire. Princess Alice was the daughter of Prince Louis of Battenberg, later known in Britain as Louis Mountbatten, who had served with distinction in the Royal Navy. Her mother was Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. The Hessian connection was strong. Princess Victoria was the daughter of Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's second daughter, who had married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. This web of ties meant that Philip's maternal family was firmly anchored in the Hessian and Battenberg houses, which were closely linked to both British and German traditions. The Battenberg family, however, had its own complexities. Originally a morganatic branch of the House of Hesse, they were not considered equal in rank to some of the great dynasties of Europe. Over time, however, they rose in status and became closely tied to Britain. During the First World War, anti-German feeling in Britain was so strong that the family abandoned its German title and adopted the more English-sounding name Mountbatten. Philip's uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, became one of the most prominent figures in mid-20th century Britain, serving as Admiral of the Fleet, Viceroy of India, and mentor to Philip himself. Yet behind this anglicized name lay the forgotten truth of German nobility, a truth that was awkward in a century where Germany was twice at war with Britain. For Philip, this German inheritance was both a source of connection and a liability. His sisters had all married German princes, some of whom became aligned with the Nazi regime during the 1930s. This created tension when Philip sought to marry Princess Elizabeth. The Second World War had left deep scars, and the prospect of the heir to the British throne marrying a man with close German family ties was sensitive. None of his sisters were invited to his wedding in 1947, a sign of how fraught these connections were. While his naval service for Britain made his personal loyalty clear, the tangled family ties to Germany were something the monarchy preferred not to highlight. If the German side was awkward, the Russian side was tragic. Through his mother's lineage, Philip was directly related to the Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia. His maternal grandmother, Princess Victoria of Hesse, was the sister of Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II. This made Philip a great-nephew of the last Tsarina and a grandnephew by marriage of the last Tsar. More personally, the Tsar and Tsarina were first cousins to Philip's mother, Princess Alice, and Nicholas II was also a cousin to King George V of Britain, showing once again how deeply intertwined the royal families of Europe were at the time. The fate of the Romanovs in the Russian Revolution of 1917 cast a long shadow over Philip's family. The execution of Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their children by Bolshevik forces was not only a human tragedy, but also a stark warning of how vulnerable even the most powerful royal houses could be. For Philip, who was just a child when these events took place, the echoes remained. His mother had grown up close to her Russian cousins, and their violent deaths were a lasting grief within the family. Later in life, Philip played a crucial role in helping to identify the remains of the Romanovs after they were discovered, providing DNA samples that confirmed their identity. This was more than a scientific act. It was a personal link to relatives whose downfall showed the fragility of monarchy in a turbulent century. The intertwining of German and Russian ties in Philip's ancestry reflects the paradox of his position. On one hand, these connections gave him immense privilege. He could claim kinship with almost every royal family in Europe. He was at home in a network that spanned kingdoms and empires, and through it he had relatives in high places wherever he turned. On the other hand, these very ties brought danger and difficulty. They tied him to monarchies that had fallen, to regimes that had collapsed, and to political movements that had brought ruin. They also exposed him to suspicion in Britain during the war years, when German ancestry was a liability, and linked him to Russian relatives who had met a brutal end. This dual reality shaped Philip's outlook. He was never sentimental about monarchy, never one to cloak it in romantic notions of divine right or unshakable grandeur. His family history had shown him otherwise. He had seen how Greek monarchs could be exiled, how German relatives could be compromised, and how Romanovs could be executed. For Philip, royalty was not a guarantee of safety, but a responsibility to adapt, to survive, and to serve. This explains much about his sharp, sometimes unsparing view of duty. He did not indulge illusions because his own lineage had been stripped of them by history. The German and Russian elements also reinforced his sense of being European rather than narrowly British. While he gave up his foreign titles to marry Elizabeth and embraced his role as a British subject, his identity was formed across borders. He spoke several languages, had relatives in nearly every country of Europe, and carried within him the awareness of both the privileges and the dangers of those connections. It is telling that his closest mentor was Lord Louis Mountbatten, the very relative who embodied the shift from Battenberg to Mountbatten, from German to anglicized nobility, from continental roots to British service. Through Mountbatten, Philip was anchored in Britain, but the continental echoes never left him. There is a certain irony in how these extensive ties shaped his destiny. They led to privilege in the sense that his marriage to Elizabeth could draw upon the shared heritage of European royalty, making it natural for a young Greek-born prince of Danish, German, and Russian lineage to be considered a suitable match. At the same time, they led to peril because they brought suspicion, awkward associations, and the constant reminder of how precarious crowns could be. Philip's life was lived at the intersection of these two realities, and his character was forged by navigating them with resilience. Seen in this light, his role as consort takes on new meaning. He was not merely the supportive husband of a queen, but also the embodiment of the survival of monarchy through adaptation. His German nobility had to be rebranded as British. His Russian ties had to be remembered with reverence, but kept in the background. His Greek and Danish roots had to be acknowledged yet subordinated to his role in Britain. Out of this complex heritage emerged a man who understood that monarchy endured not through pretending it was eternal, but through recognizing its fragility and adjusting to the demands of the age. If we trace the lines back through his ancestry, we see the broad pattern. Denmark provided the throne for his family in Greece. Germany gave him noble lineage that later had to be reshaped. Russia gave him tragic reminders of monarchy's fall, and Britain gave him the stage on which to live out his adult life. The connections were not random. They were the result of the deliberate intermarriage of Europe's dynasties in the 19th century, when rulers believed that binding royal houses together would bring peace and stability. Instead, the First World War and the revolutions that followed revealed the weakness of that system, tearing apart families that were once united in kinship. Philip's life was the living legacy of both the grand design and its failure. The German and Russian connections, then, were not side notes in his story. They were essential to understanding who he was and how he saw the world. They explain his toughness, his refusal to indulge in illusions, and his lifelong emphasis on service as the anchor of royalty. For Philip, crowns could fall, thrones could be lost, and dynasties could collapse. The only thing that endured was the work one put into the role. That lesson was learned from a heritage that carried both immense privilege and profound peril, from the Hessians and Battenbergs to the Romanovs, and it defined the way he lived until the end. When we look closely at the long and winding path that shaped Prince Philip, what emerges is not a simple tale of a man who married into Britain's monarchy, but a narrative woven from many strands, each marked by privilege and peril. His Greek roots exposed him to exile and fragility. His Danish heritage connected him to one of Europe's most adaptable royal dynasties. His German ancestry linked him to families that had to hide or transform their identity in a century marked by suspicion and war, and his Russian connections bound him to the tragic fate of the Romanovs. These elements together did not make him an ordinary royal, nor did they place him firmly in one tradition. Instead, they made him an outsider of sorts, someone whose background was far too varied to be confined within the neat boundaries of a single nation. Paradoxically, it was this very outsider identity that prepared him better than anyone else to become the consort of a queen whose role demanded both stability and adaptation. Philip's life as consort was unlike that of any of his predecessors in Britain. Male consorts were rare in British history, and there was no clear blueprint for what he should do or how he should fit into the institution. Yet Philip's own life had prepared him for this kind of ambiguity. He had never grown up with certainty. His childhood had been marked by exile, loss, and the scattering of his family across Europe. He knew how to adjust to new surroundings, how to carve out a role for himself when one was not clearly set. If he had been born into a monarchy that remained stable and secure, he might have expected clear instructions and privileges. But his fractured upbringing gave him a resilience and independence of spirit that were vital in his unusual position. This sense of being an outsider was not something he rejected. He made use of it. He could stand slightly apart from the institution into which he married and see its flaws as well as its strengths. He pushed for modernization, sometimes in ways that made traditionalists uneasy, but always with the conviction that monarchy could only endure if it adapted. His efforts to streamline the workings of Buckingham Palace, his interest in science, industry, and conservation, and his involvement in initiatives like the Duke of Edinburgh Award were not merely hobbies. They were part of his attempt to make royalty relevant in a changing world. That vision was shaped not in the halls of a secure palace, but in the unsettled path of his youth, where survival depended on finding new roles and new ways to belong. Philip's modern outlook is often described as being ahead of its time. He cared about environmental issues before they became common in public debate. He supported young people in developing confidence and skills through the award scheme that now spans the globe. He insisted that the monarchy open itself more to public view, famously supporting the idea of a televised coronation and documentaries that showed the royal family in everyday moments. While not all these efforts were universally welcomed, they reflected a belief that monarchy could not survive on mystique alone. It needed to be understood as human, adaptable, and in touch with society. That conviction likely owed much to Philip's awareness that crowns were not sacred objects immune from loss, but fragile institutions that could vanish if they did not evolve. His willingness to be direct, sometimes even blunt, also stemmed from his unconventional upbringing. Where other royals might have been cushioned by ceremony and deference, Philip had grown up without the security of constant parental guidance, without the protection of a stable royal household, and without the assurance that his titles meant anything lasting. He developed a plain-spoken manner that sometimes drew criticism, but also gave him an authenticity that many appreciated. His humor, his sharpness, and his refusal to stand on ceremony were part of a character formed by hardship as much as privilege. He had known what it was like to lose status and to be overlooked, and he never forgot that. The irony of Philip's life is that the very things that seemed to make him an odd choice, his complex background, his lack of British roots, his outsider status, were the qualities that made him so well suited to his role. A consort who had known only privilege might have struggled with the constant need to walk one step behind the sovereign, to dedicate his life to supporting another. But Philip's own life had taught him resilience, service, and adaptability. He did not need the spotlight to validate his role. He understood that support, though less visible, could be just as powerful. His naval career, where discipline and teamwork mattered more than individual glory, also prepared him for this. To dedicate oneself to a larger cause, even when recognition is limited, was something he had already learned long before he stood beside Elizabeth. Philip's diverse lineage also highlighted a broader truth about monarchy. It is rarely the product of just one nation. Though often presented as national symbols, royal families have historically been European networks, bound together by intermarriage, treaties, and shared ancestry. Philip's life was perhaps the clearest example of this reality in the 20th century. He embodied Greece through his birth, Denmark through his grandfather's dynasty, Germany through his Battenberg and Hessian ties, Russia through his Romanov relatives, and Britain through his adopted identity and service. To reduce him to any single identity would be to ignore the very richness of his heritage. This tapestry of ancestry also served as a reminder of how deeply intertwined European history is. The First World War showed how cousins ruling in different countries could end up as enemies on the battlefield. The Russian Revolution revealed how close family ties did not guarantee safety from political upheaval. Philip's life carried the marks of these lessons. He knew that privilege and peril were often two sides of the same coin, and he lived with an awareness that titles alone did not secure respect. It was what one did with the position, not the position itself, that mattered. In this sense, Philip can be seen as one of the first truly modern royals, not because he abandoned tradition, but because he recognized its limits and sought to adapt it to new realities. His efforts were not always easy or welcomed, and his bluntness sometimes caused offense. Yet his influence helped to prepare the monarchy for a changing age, making it more transparent, more engaged with society, and more aware of its responsibilities beyond mere ceremony. The legacy of his diverse lineage is not just a story of bloodlines and ancestry. It is a story of how personal history shapes public duty. The exile from Greece, the Danish dynasty's survival, the German connections that had to be reshaped, the Russian relatives whose tragic fate underscored the fragility of monarchy. All these elements created a man who understood both the weight and the vulnerability of royalty. That understanding guided him through more than 70 years at the side of the Queen, a role that demanded both strength and humility. Philip's life reminds us that monarchy is never just about one country or one tradition. It is about the intersections of many histories, the survival of dynasties through adaptation, and the resilience of individuals who carry those histories within them. Philip embodied this complexity more than most. He was the grandson of a Danish king, the son of a Greek prince, the nephew of German nobility, the great-nephew of the last Russian Tsar, and the husband of Britain's longest-reigning monarch. His story is proof that royalty is never simple and never confined to a single nation. It is a web of connections, both a source of privilege and a reminder of fragility. His enduring legacy lies not only in the public roles he performed, but also in the example he set of how diverse and even fractured beginnings can prepare someone for service of the highest order. He was never a conventional royal, and he never pretended to be. Instead, he turned his unusual path into a strength, bringing to the British monarchy a perspective shaped by exile, survival, and adaptation. In doing so, he left behind not just the image of a consort, but the legacy of a man who embodied the truth that behind every crown lies a story of many nations, many struggles, and many lessons.